Imagine the worst-case scenario. 42 days after the pandemic's final mutation killed 96% of humanity in 72 hours, Jamal Thompson crouches beside a crystal-clear mountain stream in the Colorado Rockies, watching a 12-year-old boy named Danny reach for a handful of water that will almost certainly kill him within 48 hours. And the choice Jamal faces in this single frozen moment will determine whether the survival knowledge he carries dies with him or lives on to save thousands. The water looks pristine, tastes clean, sparkles in the June sunlight like liquid diamonds, and contains a microscopic army of Giardia parasites, Cryptosporidium oocysts, and bacteria that survived the collapse because nature doesn't care about human catastrophe. Danny's lips are cracked from dehydration. His fever from infected blisters has climbed to 102 degrees, and he has been following Jamal for 6 days through the mountain wilderness after the boy's refugee camp was overrun by desperate survivors willing to kill for canned food. Jamal knows that stopping the boy means explaining why, and explaining why means revealing that almost every water source on Earth is now contaminated with human waste from 7 billion corpses decomposing in rivers, lakes, and groundwater systems, a truth so devastating that it has driven survivors to suicide rather than face the reality of their situation. The former hydraulic engineer turned survival instructor can see 3 other survivors watching from the tree line, refugees from Denver who have been tracking them for 2 days, and he knows that what he does next will either teach them the single most critical survival skill in the post-collapse world, or send them fleeing in terror from knowledge they cannot accept. The stream burbles innocently over smooth stones. The mountain air smells of pine and wildflowers, and Danny's hand is 6 inches from the water when Jamal makes his choice, grabbing the boy's wrist with enough force to leave fingerprints, and begins the lesson that will define the rest of their lives. Time stops. Every survival situation demands this moment of truth, when you either act with knowledge that seems cruel or watch someone die from kindness that kills. The temperature is 68 degrees. The sky is cloudless blue, and Jamal Thompson takes a breath and starts speaking the words that will save or destroy this child's hope in a world where clean water is now more valuable than gold, more rare than mercy, and more essential than love itself. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light from this survivor's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world, you are listening to me. This is the story of Jamal Thompson, a 35-year-old hydraulic engineer who spent 15 years designing water treatment systems for cities across the American West, who lost his wife and twin daughters in the first week of the pandemic, and who discovered that his technical knowledge of water purification was the only thing standing between the scattered remnants of humanity and death by dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever. In the aftermath of the collapse, when the pumping stations fell silent and the treatment plants became monuments to a civilization that died in 3 days, Jamal found himself teaching a lesson that should have been simple, but became the foundation of survival itself. The water that looks cleanest will kill you fastest, and the only thing separating the living from the dead is understanding that nature was never your friend, never safe, never clean without human intervention. This is not a story about building shelters or finding food. This is a story about the invisible threat that stalks every survivor, the enemy you cannot see or taste or smell, the contamination that turns your own body into a battlefield where bacteria multiply and parasites feast, and dehydration steals your last rational thought. This is the story of how knowledge becomes medicine, how teaching becomes survival, how one man's engineering background became the difference between extinction and hope in a world where clean water is the first miracle you must create every single day. Danny's wrist feels thin as bird bones beneath Jamal's grip, and the boy's eyes fill with tears that have nothing to do with pain and everything to do with confusion, because every instinct in his dehydrated body is screaming that the water is right there, right there. Just let me drink. Jamal understands this desperation with the intimacy of someone who watched his 6-year-old daughters die calling for water he couldn't purify fast enough, whose last memory of his wife Sarah is her asking him to please just give them the water from the decorative pond in their suburban Denver backyard, and who learned that love without knowledge is just another way to kill the people you're trying to save. The 3 refugees emerge from the trees, 2 women and an elderly man, their clothes hanging on frames that have lost 30 pounds in 6 weeks, their eyes holding the hollow look of people who have drunk from streams and rivers and puddles. Because what choice did they have? Who are now dealing with the cramping and fever and bloody diarrhea that announces you have maybe 2 weeks before dehydration takes you. One of the women, her name is Elena, and she was a kindergarten teacher in Boulder before the world ended, staggers forward, and her voice cracks when she says, "Please, we need water. We need it now." And Jamal sees that her hands are shaking with early-stage cholera symptoms, the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, turning her intestines into a disaster zone, dehydrating her so fast that she could lose 30% of her body weight in 24 hours if the infection runs unchecked. Jamal releases Danny's wrist and stands slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the stream, and he begins the lesson by asking a question that sounds cruel but is actually mercy. How many of you have been sick in the last 2 weeks? All 4 hands go up. Cramping, diarrhea, fever, vomiting, headaches that feel like ice picks behind the eyes. Elena nods, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. The elderly man, whose name is Marcus and who was a dentist in Lakewood before retirement, admits that he has been drinking from every water source they pass because dying of thirst seemed worse than dying of sickness, a logical fallacy that has killed more survivors than the pandemic itself. The other woman, Yuki, 28 years old and 7 months pregnant, whispers that her baby has been kicking less in the past 3 days, and she knows that means dehydration is affecting the fetus, that she is slowly killing her unborn child because she cannot figure out how to make water safe. Danny sits down hard on the rocky ground, his fever making him dizzy, and asks the question they are all thinking. If we can't drink the water, how do we survive? Jamal crouches beside his backpack, the military surplus ruck that contains everything he has salvaged from his destroyed life, and pulls out 3 items that will become their salvation. A clear, plastic 2-liter bottle, a plastic bag full of charcoal chunks pulled from a burned-out cabin, a ceramic water filter he scavenged from a sporting goods store in Vale. He sets these objects on a flat rock, like artifacts from an alien civilization, and he begins teaching the fundamental truth about water in the post-apocalypse. Every drop you drink has traveled through or near a human corpse. Every surface water source is contaminated with fecal bacteria. Every pristine mountain stream can carry parasites that survived millions of years of evolution specifically to hijack your intestines, and the only way to survive is to become a human water treatment plant. Using nothing but knowledge, patience, and materials, you can scavenge from the ruins. The sun climbs higher in the cloudless sky, and Jamal Thompson starts building the first of 6 water purification systems that will keep them alive long enough to reach the survivor community in Utah, where his sister might still be waiting, might still be alive, might still remember that her brother once promised he would find her no matter how far the world fell. The first method is the simplest and the slowest, and the one that requires nothing but clear plastic and sunlight and patience that most survivors don't have, because panic makes you stupid, desperation makes you careless, and thirst makes you willing to risk everything for immediate relief. Jamal fills the clear 2-liter bottle with stream water, watching the sediment settle as he explains that ultraviolet radiation from the sun will kill most bacteria, viruses, and parasites if you expose the water to direct sunlight for 6 hours at temperatures above 68 degrees, a technique called SODIS that saved millions of lives in developing countries before the collapse and will save millions more now that the entire developed world has become developing again. Danny asks why 6 hours, his voice thick with fever, and Jamal explains that UVA rays penetrate the water and disrupt the DNA of microorganisms, preventing them from reproducing. But the process takes time because evolution made these organisms tough, and sunlight alone is a slow weapon against an enemy that has survived since the dawn of life on Earth. He sets 3 bottles in direct sunlight on the flat rocks, positions them on their sides to maximize surface area exposure, and marks each with a stick indicating when the 6-hour timer started, a primitive clock that measures the distance between contamination and safety. Elena collapses against a tree trunk, her skin grey with dehydration, and Jamal knows that 6 hours is too long for her, that cholera can kill in 12 hours if the dehydration becomes severe enough that she needs water now or she needs a grave. The ceramic filter becomes their second line of defense, a hollow fiber membrane filter with pores sized at 0. 1 microns, small enough to block bacteria and parasites but not viruses, which means it will remove Giardia and Cryptosporidium, but not the pandemic virus particles that might still be lurking in water that touched infected corpses. Jamal assembles the filter using a salvaged plastic bucket, punching a hole in the bottom and threading the filter element through, explaining as he works that ceramic filters can process about 1 liter per hour and can be cleaned with a soft brush when they clog with sediment, a maintenance ritual that will become as essential as breathing. He demonstrates the backflushing technique, pushing clean water backward through the filter to dislodge accumulated particles, and Yuki watches with the intensity of someone memorizing every movement because her baby's survival depends on getting this right. The filtered water drips slowly into a second container, each drop representing a small victory over invisible enemies. And Jamal passes the first cup to Elena, with instructions to drink slowly, to let her ravaged digestive system adjust to the sudden influx of clean fluid, to resist the urge to gulp because that will trigger more vomiting and waste the precious resource they have fought so hard to create. Marcus asks about viruses, his dentist's knowledge of infectious disease making him worried about pathogens small enough to slip through any filter. And Jamal responds by building the third purification system using the charcoal from his backpack. Activated charcoal removes chemical contaminants, heavy metals, and some organic compounds through a process called adsorption, where molecules stick to the carbon surface like flies on flypaper, and while it won't kill bacteria or viruses by itself, it can remove the toxins that make contaminated water taste like death and smell like sewage. Jamal crushes the charcoal chunks into smaller pieces using a rock, creating a coarse powder that he layers into a cut plastic bottle, alternating charcoal with sand and gravel to create a basic filtration column that water can flow through by gravity. He explains that this is a roughing filter, designed to remove sediment and improve taste before the water goes through the ceramic filter, that multiple barriers are better than single barriers because survival is about redundancy, about never trusting one system when 2 systems will save your life if the first one fails. The stream continues its innocent burbling, and Danny asks the question that Jamal has been dreading. If the water is so dangerous, how did people survive before all this engineering? The answer is, that they didn't survive well, that cholera killed millions every year before modern sanitation, that dysentery was a leading cause of death in armies throughout history, that the reason human civilization built sewage systems and water treatment plants was because drinking contaminated water was a slow-motion genocide that killed more humans than war, famine, and plague combined. Jamal softens this brutal truth by explaining that human bodies can adapt to local water sources over time, building immunity to specific bacteria, but that adaptation requires exposing yourself to small amounts of contamination repeatedly, a strategy that might work in stable environments but is suicide in the post-collapse world, where you're moving through different water sources constantly, encountering new microorganisms your immune system has never seen, fighting battles your body cannot win without help. Elena's hands have stopped shaking after 2 liters of filtered water, the rehydration reversing her early cholera symptoms enough to give her a fighting chance if they can keep her drinking clean fluid and prevent reinfection. A big if in a world where sanitation is now a luxury most survivors cannot afford. The sun reaches its zenith, and Jamal begins teaching the 4th purification method, the one that requires fire and patience and a metal container, but is the gold standard of water treatment because it kills everything, absolutely everything, if you do it right. Boiling water at a rolling boil for 1 minute at sea level, 3 minutes above 6,500 feet elevation, because water boils at lower temperatures as atmospheric pressure decreases, is the only method that guarantees destruction of all bacteria, viruses, parasites, and their eggs or cysts. The only technique that makes water as safe as the treated water that once flowed from every tap in America without anyone appreciating the miracle of turning a handle and receiving clean water instantly. Jamal uses Danny's fever as a teaching moment, explaining that high temperature denatures proteins, breaks down cell membranes, and disrupts the molecular machinery that keeps microorganisms alive. That boiling is essentially cooking your enemies until they die. A process that requires fuel and time, but delivers certainty in a world where certainty has become more valuable than gold. He builds a fire using flint and steel, teaching them the bow drill method as backup because matches will run out and lighters will break, and fire-starting knowledge is survival knowledge, arranging the kindling in a teepee structure that maximizes airflow and minimizes fuel consumption because every piece of wood you burn is a piece you have to find and carry and guard from other survivors who need it just as desperately. Yuki sits close to the fire, her pregnant belly pressing against her knees, and confesses that she has been avoiding boiling water because it seemed like too much work, too much time, too much fuel. And Jamal responds with a truth that sounds harsh, but is actually compassion. The dysentery that killed her husband 3 weeks ago, that infection that started as stomach cramps and ended with him bleeding out from intestinal hemorrhaging, could have been prevented if they had boiled every drop of water they drank. If they had prioritized the invisible threat over the visible comfort of quick, easy water from rivers and streams. Her tears fall into the dirt, and Danny reaches out to hold her hand because even children understand grief in this new world. And Jamal continues teaching because stopping to acknowledge pain means giving pain power over your survival, means losing focus on the critical knowledge that will keep everyone else alive. The water in the metal pot begins to bubble, small bubbles first and then large ones, and Jamal explains that you must wait for the rolling boil where the entire surface is in violent motion, not just simmering or gentle bubbling, because temperature is everything, and partial heating only creates false confidence that gets people killed. Marcus produces a battered notebook and pencil from his pocket, the first writing implements Jamal has seen in 2 weeks, and begins taking notes with the dedication of a student who understands that this information is literally life and death. That forgetting a single step could mean infection, and infection means suffering, and suffering means becoming a burden to your community, and becoming a burden means being left behind because resources are finite, and mercy is a luxury calculated in calories and water and the cold mathematics of survival. The notebook fills with diagrams showing filter construction, lists of boiling times at different elevations, reminders about backflushing techniques and charcoal layer depths. And Jamal feels something he hasn't felt since the collapse. A spark of purpose that goes beyond just staying alive another day, the recognition that teaching is survival for the species even when individuals die, that knowledge preserved is humanity's only real weapon against extinction. He adds a fifth purification method to Marcus's notes: chemical treatment using bleach or iodine, the technique that requires household bleach at 5 to 6% sodium hypochlorite concentration, 2 drops per litre of clear water or 4 drops per litre of cloudy water, waiting 30 minutes before drinking to allow the chlorine to kill microorganisms, and understanding that chemical treatment doesn't remove parasites as reliably as filtration or boiling, but is better than nothing when you're moving fast and can't wait 6 hours for solar purification. The afternoon shadows lengthen, and the group begins to understand that they are learning a survival protocol, not just emergency techniques, that water purification needs to become as automatic as breathing, because contamination never sleeps, never takes a day off, never gives you a break just because you're tired or scared or mourning the people you couldn't save. Jamal teaches them the sixth method using nothing but sand, gravel and cloth, constructing a slow sand filter by layering materials in a bucket with the finest sand at the bottom and the coarsest gravel at the top, explaining that biological filtration happens when bacteria colonies grow on sand grains and consume other bacteria, a living filter that improves over time and can run continuously if you maintain it properly by scraping off the top layer when flow rates decrease. Danny's fever begins to break after drinking 2 liters of boiled water and receiving a crushed aspirin that Marcus contributed from his emergency kit, the anti-inflammatory, bringing his temperature down enough that he can focus on the lesson instead of drifting in and out of delirium. And he asks Jamal how to know if water is contaminated when it looks clean, tastes fine, and smells normal. The answer comes in the form of a story that Jamal has told himself every night since the collapse, the memory that keeps him teaching instead of giving up, the reason he cannot stop moving from group to group, spreading this knowledge like a prophet of the invisible apocalypse. His daughters, Maya and Sophia, 6 years old and beautiful and trusting, died on day 4 of the pandemic because their father made a single mistake. He gave them water from the backyard pond after their treated water ran out, clear water that looked safe and tasted clean, and within 36 hours they were in kidney failure from E. coli bacteria that turned their intestines into war zones. His wife Sarah died trying to find clean water for the girls, collapsed in a neighbor's yard while searching for bottled water that had been looted weeks earlier. And Jamal found her body being consumed by the neighbor's dogs because animal behavior changed when humans stopped maintaining civilization and hunger made predators of pets. He did not cry telling this story because tears were for people who still believed crying solved problems. But his voice cracked when he explained that every technique he is teaching them was researched in the desperate hours while his children died, that he learned about water purification by reading engineering manuals on his phone while the battery died and the network failed and the world collapsed around him. That knowledge came too late to save his family, but came in time to save thousands of others if he could just keep teaching, keep moving, keep finding survivors who hadn't yet figured out that the water was going to kill them long before starvation or violence or despair. Elena stands for the first time in hours, her rehydration complete enough that she can walk without staggering. And she approaches Jamal with a question that shows she's thinking beyond immediate survival into the long-term challenge of rebuilding. How do we teach this to people who don't have engineering backgrounds, who can't understand the science, who just want simple instructions they can follow without thinking? Jamal's response reveals the teaching philosophy that has kept him alive and effective. You don't need to understand why boiling works to boil water. You don't need to know the molecular structure of activated charcoal to build a charcoal filter. You just need to follow the steps and trust that people figured this out before you were born, and that their knowledge is now your inheritance, passed from generation to generation, not through schools anymore, but through campfire lessons and desperate teaching moments beside contaminated streams. He simplifies the entire conversation into 6 rules that Marcus writes down in large capital letters. 1. Never drink untreated water, no matter how clean it looks. 2. Boiling for 1 minute kills everything. 3. Solar purification takes 6 hours in direct sunlight. 4 filters need backflushing or they stop working. 5. Activated charcoal removes chemicals and improves taste. 6. Multiple methods are better than single methods. Yuki asks about rainwater, whether catching precipitation before it hits the ground means it's safe to drink, and Jamal explains that rainwater is cleaner than surface water, but still requires treatment because atmospheric particles, bird droppings on collection surfaces, and container contamination introduce risk that isn't worth taking when boiling takes 3 minutes and guarantees safety. He teaches them how to construct a rain catchment system using plastic sheeting and clean containers, how to filter the first few minutes of rainfall to remove accumulated dirt from the collection surface, how to store treated water in covered containers to prevent recontamination from insects, dust, and desperate survivors who might not understand the difference between clean and safe. Danny practices assembling the ceramic filter under Jamal's supervision, taking it apart and putting it back together until the movements become automatic. Muscle memory that will serve him in the dark or in panic or when exhaustion makes thinking impossible, and Marcus photographs the process using a disposable camera because someone had the foresight to stockpile pre-digital technology that doesn't require electricity to preserve information. The sun drops toward the western peaks, painting the sky in oranges and purples that would be beautiful if beauty still mattered more than survival. And Jamal makes the decision that will define the next phase of their journey. They will stay at this location for 3 days while Elena recovers from cholera, while Danny's fever completely breaks, while Yuki regains strength for the challenging mountain crossing ahead. And during those 3 days, they will build a permanent water purification station that other survivors can use, a gift to the future that costs them time and effort and fuel, but might save lives of people they will never meet. The concept sounds altruistic until Jamal explains the practical mathematics. Every survivor who dies from contaminated water is a potential ally, teacher, farmer, doctor, engineer, or parent who could have contributed to rebuilding civilization. And saving strangers is actually saving yourself, because humanity's survival depends on critical mass, on enough people staying alive long enough to remember how to do the complicated things like manufacturing antibiotics, generating electricity, and growing food at scale. They work through the evening building a multi-stage filtration system that uses the stream's own flow to push water through filters, eliminating the need for manual pumping or electrical power. Jamal designs a settling basin where sediment can drop out of the water before it enters the filtration system, extending filter life and improving treatment efficiency. Elena contributes knowledge from her kindergarten teaching days about creating simple instructions, using pictures and symbols for survivors who might not read English or any language, drawing cartoons that show stick figures boiling water and getting happy faces, stick figures drinking raw water and getting sick faces, universal communication that transcends language barriers because death doesn't care what language you speak. Marcus leverages his dentistry background to teach about oral rehydration therapy, mixing precise ratios of salt, sugar, and clean water to replace electrolytes lost during diarrheal illness, explaining that most diarrhea deaths are actually dehydration deaths and that simple sugar-salt solutions have saved more lives than antibiotics throughout human history. Yuki uses her pregnancy as a teaching case, explaining that fetuses require absolutely clean water for proper development, that maternal dehydration affects amniotic fluid levels, that every contaminated drink she took in her first trimester potentially exposed her baby to toxins that might cause developmental problems, a burden of guilt she carries but transforms into motivation to teach other pregnant survivors before they make the same mistakes. The 3-day camp becomes a masterclass in water security, with Jamal teaching progressively advanced concepts as the group's understanding deepens. They learn about cryptosporidiosis, the parasitic infection caused by Cryptosporidium oocysts that survive chlorine treatment and require filtration or boiling to remove, the infection that causes watery diarrhea lasting 2 weeks or more in people with healthy immune systems, and can be fatal in those whose immunity is compromised by starvation, stress, or previous illness. They learn about giardiasis, caused by Giardia lamblia parasites that create sulfur-smelling diarrhea, gas, and cramps that can last for months if untreated, that turn mountain streams into intestinal nightmares for hikers who believe the myth that running water is safe water. They learn about cholera's terrifying ability to dehydrate victims so rapidly that people can die within hours of first symptoms, about the rice water stool that signals massive fluid loss, about the muscle cramps and sunken eyes and cold, clammy skin that announce your body is shutting down from lack of water, even while your intestines pour out gallons of contaminated fluid. Danny asks why bacteria want to kill us, and Jamal explains that bacteria don't want anything, they just reproduce in environments that provide warmth and moisture and nutrients, and human intestines happen to be perfect bacterial breeding grounds, that we are just collateral damage in organisms following their evolutionary programming to survive and multiply. Marcus discovers a hand pump well behind an abandoned ranger station, a pre-collapse water source that might be safer than surface water because groundwater filtered through soil and rock naturally. But Jamal tempers this optimism by explaining that collapse-related contamination has likely reached groundwater through seepage from surface bodies, from mass graves and corpse decomposition and failed septic systems leaching pathogens into aquifers, that groundwater is slower to contaminate than surface water, but once contaminated, can stay dangerous for years or decades because underground water moves slowly and bacteria can survive in darkness where UV radiation doesn't reach. They test the well water using a makeshift clarity test, comparing it against boiled stream water and noting that the well water appears slightly clearer, but Jamal insists on boiling it anyway because appearances deceive and survival depends on treating invisible threats as real, on never gambling with contamination, even when the odds seem favorable, on accepting that paranoia about water quality is actually rational caution in a world where one bad drink can start a cascade toward death. Elena organizes the camp's water storage system, using salvaged containers to separate raw water, filtered water, and boiled water with clear labels that even illiterate survivors can understand through color coding and symbol systems. She teaches the concept of water discipline, explaining that every person needs about 1 gallon per day for drinking and basic hygiene, that water for washing hands before eating and after defecating prevents disease transmission, that the human instinct to conserve water by skipping hand washing is exactly backward, because using a little water for hygiene saves enormous amounts of water that would otherwise go toward treating waterborne diseases. Yuki practices fire building until she can start a sustainable blaze in under 3 minutes, using only flint, steel, and natural tinder, because boiling requires fire, and fire requires skill, and skill requires practice that happens before the emergency, not during it. Danny becomes obsessed with the ceramic filter, cleaning and maintaining it with religious dedication, understanding that this piece of technology represents the barrier between health and sickness, that taking care of tools means tools take care of you, that survival is about respecting and maintaining the systems that keep you alive even when you're tired or distracted or grieving. On the second day, a new group of survivors appears from the direction of Denver, 8 people in terrible condition, with signs of advanced dysentery, cholera, and giardiasis, their bodies wasted from weeks of drinking contaminated water and suffering the consequences without understanding the cause. Jamal faces a choice that has become familiar in the post-collapse world. Help them and risk depleting resources, or turn them away and guarantee their deaths, but preserve supplies for the current group. Elena makes the decision for him by welcoming the newcomers and immediately starting triage, using her teacher's ability to organize chaos into manageable tasks. And Jamal recognizes that this is how civilization rebuilds, one act of generosity at a time, one person choosing humanity over self-preservation, one small decision that compounds across thousands of similar moments into something that might eventually resemble society again. The newcomers include a former paramedic named Rashid, whose medical knowledge combines with Jamal's engineering expertise to create comprehensive survival protocols, a teenage girl named Maya, whose name breaks Jamal's heart, but whose fierce intelligence and desire to learn makes him believe his daughter's memories live on in other young people fighting to survive, and an elderly woman named May, who speaks limited English but communicates through gestures and drawings that she was a civil engineer in China before immigrating to America, that she understands water systems at a level matching Jamal's, that knowledge transcends language barriers when survival is at stake. Rashid confirms Jamal's worst fears about disease spread in the survivor population. He estimates that 70% of survivors are currently infected with at least one waterborne pathogen, that the mortality rate from diarrheal illness is approaching 15%, that more people are dying from contaminated water than from violence or starvation, that the collapse has essentially reset human civilization to pre-sanitation conditions where infectious disease is the leading cause of death. He describes treating patients with such severe dehydration that their skin tense when pinched, their eyes sink back into skulls, their tongues swell and crack and bleed, and he admits that without oral rehydration solutions and clean water for recovery, his medical skills are nearly worthless because you cannot treat dehydration with medicine, only with fluid replacement, and fluid replacement requires clean water in quantities that most survivor camps cannot produce. Maya asks questions that reveal sharp analytical thinking, understanding that water purification is not just about individual survival, but about community health, that one person drinking contaminated water and then preparing food for others spreads disease to the entire group, that survival requires social protocols and enforcement mechanisms, and leadership willing to make unpopular decisions, like enforcing water treatment even when people resist or complain or claim they don't have time. May draws diagrams in the dirt, showing slow sand filter construction at scales that could serve 50 to 100 people, community water treatment systems that require initial investment of labor and materials but provide long-term safety for entire survivor camps, infrastructure that transforms temporary shelters into permanent settlements by solving the most critical limiting factor for human habitation. Jamal and May communicate through Marcus's translation of her drawings, developing designs for settling basins that use gravity to remove sediment, for chlorination systems that use scavenged pool chemicals at precise ratios to disinfect large volumes of water, for storage systems that prevent recontamination while allowing easy access, for backup systems that activate when primary systems fail, because redundancy is the foundation of reliable engineering. They identify a location downstream from the current camp where a natural rock formation creates a depression perfect for a settling basin, where elevation drop provides enough head pressure to drive water through multiple filter stages without pumping, where south-facing exposure allows solar purification as a supplementary treatment method. And they begin construction immediately because every day delayed means more deaths in survivor camps that could be saved if only they knew what these 12 people know. The work is brutal, moving rocks and digging channels and building structures with hand tools scavenged from abandoned hardware stores. But the effort creates something Jamal hasn't felt since the collapse: collective purpose that transcends individual survival. The recognition that building something bigger than yourself is actually the most selfish thing you can do, because humans are social animals who need community to maintain sanity, who need purpose to avoid despair, who need to contribute to something meaningful, or depression steals motivation to keep fighting. Danny works alongside adults twice his size, carrying rocks and fetching tools and learning through participation. And Jamal sees that childhood in the post-collapse world is not about protection from harsh realities, but about integration into adult responsibilities, about teaching survival skills early and completely so that 12-year-olds can function as contributing members of communities that cannot afford to support dependents for 18 years. Elena leads work songs that make the labor bearable, old folk songs and church hymns and childhood rhymes that connect them to pre-collapse culture, reminding them that humans sang while building pyramids and cathedrals and cities, that work songs exist because they make hard tasks easier through rhythm and shared experience. Yuki goes into labor on the third day, 9 weeks premature, because stress and malnutrition and dehydration have triggered early delivery, and Rashid transforms into crisis management mode, creating a sterile delivery area using boiled water and clean cloth and skills he developed as a paramedic before the world ended. Jamal focuses on producing enormous quantities of boiled water for cleaning the birth area, for washing hands repeatedly, for providing Yuki with fluids during labor, for preparing to clean the newborn immediately after delivery, because infection in childbirth was the leading cause of maternal death throughout human history, until people understood that cleanliness saves lives, that germs exist, that washing hands between patients prevents disease transmission. The labor lasts 11 hours, complicated by Yuki's weakened condition and the baby's early arrival, and during those 11 hours, the entire camp focuses on water production because this birth represents hope, represents the future, represents humanity's stubborn refusal to accept extinction even when survival seems impossible. Maya boils water continuously, feeding fires and managing pots and creating an assembly line that produces sterile water faster than Rashid can use it, learning through emergency that planning and systems thinking matter more than panic and improvisation. The baby arrives underweight but breathing, a girl with a surprisingly strong cry that echoes through the mountain valley, and Rashid announces that mother and daughter are stable, that Yuki will need continued hydration and monitoring for infection, that the baby requires frequent feeding and warmth and protection from environmental stresses, all of which depend on clean water for mixing formula powder scavenged from abandoned stores, for sterilizing bottles and equipment, for maintaining hygiene that prevents the deadly bacterial infections that killed most infants throughout human history before modern medicine. Yuki names her daughter Sarah, and Jamal's throat closes because his dead wife's name now belongs to this new life, this child born into apocalypse who might live to see civilization rebuild, who represents the reason that knowledge matters and teaching matters and sacrificing comfort for survival protocols matters because the future depends on babies surviving to adulthood, on children learning from adults who remember how things worked, on the chain of knowledge transmission that stretches from pre-collapse civilization through the wasteland years into whatever comes next. Marcus performs an improvised baptism using boiled water, a ritual that connects them to religious traditions predating the collapse, that acknowledges the sacred nature of clean water as life-giver, as the substance that makes biological existence possible, as the reason that every creation myth in every culture features water as the primordial element from which everything emerges. The community water system becomes operational that afternoon, with clear instructions posted using Elena's pictogram system showing exactly how to collect water from the settling basin, how to run it through the filter layers, how to verify the flow rate and backflush when needed, how to store treated water in covered containers, how to boil before drinking if you want absolute certainty, how to check for clarity and smell before trusting that the system worked correctly. Jamal teaches a final lesson to the assembled group, explaining that this infrastructure will fail eventually, that filters clog and charcoal saturates and storage containers crack and systems degrade, that the point of building it is not to create something permanent, but to demonstrate principles that survivors can replicate elsewhere, to plant seeds of knowledge that grow into forest of water treatment stations across the wasteland, to start a movement where teaching water safety becomes as natural as warning about dangerous animals or poisonous plants. He challenges them to become teachers themselves, to carry water purification knowledge to every survivor camp they encounter, to refuse the selfish temptation to hoard information as competitive advantage, and instead recognize that spreading knowledge serves everyone's survival, because healthy neighbors are better than sick neighbors, because disease spreads through populations regardless of who knows how to prevent it, because civilization's future depends on collective knowledge reaching critical mass before population decline becomes extinction spiral. Rashid contributes a medical perspective that reinforces Jamal's engineering focus. Waterborne diseases create weakened immune systems that make people vulnerable to other infections. That someone fighting giardiasis cannot also fight pneumonia effectively. That the best medicine is prevention. That clean water is more valuable than antibiotics, because preventing illness saves the antibiotics for treating injuries and infections that cannot be prevented. He teaches oral rehydration therapy to everyone present, drilling the recipe into memory: 1 liter of clean water, 6 teaspoons of sugar, half a teaspoon of salt, mix until dissolved, drink slowly to replace fluids lost to diarrhea, and understand that this simple solution saves more lives than hospitals, because most diarrhea deaths are actually dehydration deaths, and most dehydration deaths are preventable with knowledge and clean water. Maya takes notes in Marcus's journal, creating a medical reference that includes symptoms of different waterborne diseases, treatment protocols for each, signs that someone is deteriorating and needs intensive care, and guidelines for when to isolate patients to prevent disease spread through the camp, because knowledge written down survives even when teachers die, because books are how civilizations preserve information across generations, because writing is technology that predates electricity by 5,000 years and will post-date collapse by however long humanity survives. Me engineers a filtration improvement using sand harvested from a dry creek bed upstream, sorting it by particle size through improvised screens made from window mesh, layering the finest sand at the bottom of the filter column and gradually increasing grain size toward the top, creating a slow sand filter that will develop biological filtration capacity over the next 2 weeks, as beneficial bacteria colonize the sand grains and begin consuming harmful bacteria passing through the filter, transforming a physical barrier into a biological treatment system that improves over time rather than degrading. She communicates through drawings and gestures that Chinese villages used slow sand filtration for centuries before European scientists rediscovered the technique, that traditional knowledge is not primitive but sophisticated understanding accumulated over generations, that the collapse has not erased human knowledge but has simply changed how that knowledge transmits from person to person, from books and schools and internet to direct teaching and apprenticeship and hands-on demonstration. Danny asks her through Marcus's translation how people figured out water treatment before microscopes existed to show them bacteria. And her response through drawings shows people observing that some water sources cause sickness while others didn't. That experimentation and careful observation led to understanding even without seeing the mechanism. That science begins with noticing patterns and testing interventions and being honest about results. The camp gathers around the fire that evening. 13 survivors who 8 days ago were separate groups heading towards separate deaths from contaminated water, now unified by shared knowledge and collective purpose, and the recognition that teaching creates bonds stronger than blood, because chosen family matters more than genetic family in a world where most genetic families died in the collapse. Jamal stands before them, no longer just a wandering teacher but something closer to a leader, and he proposes a plan that sounds crazy until you understand the mathematics of survival. They will travel to every survivor camp between here and Utah, teaching water purification at each location, building treatment systems where possible, distributing knowledge like a virus that spreads health instead of sickness, creating a network of informed survivors who can train others, establishing a chain of teaching that continues after they pass through and eventually covers the entire western United States with life-saving knowledge. Elena suggests creating teaching songs, simple rhymes and melodies that make water treatment steps memorable, that people can teach to children who will remember long after adults die, that transform survival protocols into culture, into tradition, into the foundation for rebuilding civilization from ruins. Yuki volunteers to document their journey with a written record, a diary that describes each camp they visit, each system they build, each person they teach, each success and failure and lesson learned, creating a reference manual for future survivors who find the document, a gift to the future that costs her time and effort but might save thousands of lives decades from now when today's teachers are dead, and the knowledge needs to persist through their written words. Rashid commits to treating illness in every camp they visit, using his medical knowledge to heal people while Jamal's engineering knowledge prevents future sickness. The combination of treatment and prevention maximizing their impact on survivor health. Marcus offers his documentation skills, photography and note-taking that creates visual proof that water treatment works. Before and after images showing 6 survivors recovering after implementing clean water protocols. Evidence that can convince skeptics who don't trust verbal explanations or theoretical science. Danny asks what his role is in this traveling mission, and Jamal responds that Danny's role is to learn everything, to become the next generation of teachers, to absorb knowledge like a sponge, so that when the current teachers die from violence or disease or old age or bad luck, the knowledge continues through Danny and others like him, that investment in children is investment in humanity's future, that teaching the young is the most important work that adults can do in the post-collapse world. The fire burns down to coals, and baby Sarah cries for feeding, and Yuki prepares formula using boiled water cooled to body temperature, exact protocols that Rashid taught her for infant feeding safety. And Jamal watches this simple act of motherhood and sees civilization in miniature, sees knowledge being applied to preserve life, sees humans using intelligence and tools and cooperation to accomplish what instinct alone cannot, sees the reason that his wife and daughters died. But the lesson they taught him through their deaths continues saving lives. He thinks about Sarah, his wife, who he couldn't save because knowledge came too late, who believed him when he said the pond water looked safe, who trusted her engineer husband to keep their family alive and paid for that trust with her life and their daughters' lives. He thinks about Maya and Sophia, 6-year-old twins who loved swimming and singing and learning new things, who died calling for water that he couldn't purify fast enough, who were failed by a civilization that collapsed too quickly for anyone to prepare adequately, who represent all the children who died in the first months because adults didn't understand that water was the primary threat, not violence or starvation. He thinks about whether saving thousands of others makes up for failing to save his own family, and he concludes that it doesn't, that nothing makes up for that loss, but that continuing to teach despite the pain is how he honors their memories, how he transforms private tragedy into public service, how he ensures that their deaths meant something more than just 3 more casualties in humanity's near extinction. Marcus breaks the silence by reading aloud from his journal, a summary of everything they've learned in 3 days, a crystallization of knowledge that will be copied and distributed and taught to others. Water is contaminated everywhere. Treatment is not optional. Boiling kills everything. Filtration removes most things. Solar purification takes time but works. Multiple methods are better than single methods. Maintenance keeps systems working. Teaching spreads knowledge faster than travel. Children learn if adults teach. Survival requires community. Clean water enables everything else. The words sound simple, almost trivial, but everyone present understands that these 12 principles represent the difference between survival and extinction, between rebuilding civilization and descending into permanent collapse, between hope and despair in a world where despair is rational and hope requires conscious effort. Elena suggests turning the principles into a song, and the group spends the next hour creating a melody that makes the lessons memorable. A water purification anthem that sounds ridiculous until you realize it will be sung in survivor camps for years to come, that it will teach children who aren't born yet, that it will save lives of people this group will never meet, that culture is how humans preserve knowledge across generations, when writing is scarce and technology is dead and only memory remains. They leave the stream camp at dawn on the 4th day. 13 survivors walking west toward Utah, carrying minimal supplies but maximum knowledge, leaving behind a functioning water treatment system and clear instructions for its maintenance, planting a seed that might grow into permanent settlement, or might be destroyed by raiders, or might simply fall into disrepair when the next group of survivors doesn't understand what they're looking at. But the point is not to create permanent infrastructure, because permanence is impossible in the wasteland. The point is to demonstrate possibility, to show that water treatment can work, to teach techniques that survivors can adapt to their own locations and resources. Danny carries baby Sarah in a sling made from cloth, giving Yuki's arms a rest, practicing the careful attention that infants require, learning that children are not burdens but investments, not mouths to feed, but future adults who will continue the work of rebuilding when the current generation dies. Marcus photographs the water system from multiple angles, creating a visual reference that shows each component and how they connect. Images that will be printed when they find working equipment in survivor camps with electricity, distributed to communities that need to see success before attempting construction, proof that engineering knowledge still matters in a world without engineers. The journey west becomes a teaching tour, with the group stopping at every survivor camp they encounter to assess water situation, teach treatment methods, build systems where resources allow, and move on after 2 or 3 days when the locals understand the basics and can continue learning through practice. They meet a group of 40 survivors living in an abandoned ski resort, using snowmelt runoff without treatment because snow seems clean. And Jamal explains that snow collects atmospheric particles during formation, that snowmelt runs over ground contaminated with decomposition products from winter-killed animals and human corpses, that appearances deceive and assumptions kill, and he spends 3 days teaching them to build a multi-stage filtration system that will serve the entire resort community through the summer season. They encounter a religious community that believes prayer purifies water, that faith protects against disease, that sickness is divine punishment rather than biological reality. And Elena uses her teacher's patience to explain that God gave humans brains and hands and intelligence specifically so they could figure out water treatment, that prayer and action are not opposites but partners, that respecting the tools God provided is itself a form of prayer. And gradually the community agrees to boil water while praying over it, accepting a compromise that saves their lives while preserving their faith. They find a military group hoarding water purification tablets as currency, charging other survivors food or labor for access to chemical treatment. And Jamal has to negotiate carefully because these soldiers have weapons and violence is always an option in the wasteland. But violence solves nothing and wastes lives that humanity cannot afford to lose. Rashid suggests a trade, medical treatment for the soldiers' various injuries and infections in exchange for sharing water purification knowledge freely instead of hoarding it. And eventually the soldiers agree when they realize that healthy trading partners are more valuable than desperate victims, that lifting everyone's survival chances lifts their own through increased trade opportunities and reduced disease spread. The soldiers contribute their knowledge of military water purification systems, the advanced filtration and chemical treatment technologies that armies developed to keep troops healthy in contaminated environments. And this knowledge combines with Jamal's civilian engineering background to create hybrid systems more effective than either approach alone, demonstrating that cooperation produces better outcomes than competition, that sharing knowledge multiplies its value instead of dividing it. They meet a 15-year-old girl named Rosa, who is caring for 7 younger siblings after their parents died in the collapse, and Yuki sees herself in this young mother figure, remembers being overwhelmed and desperate and willing to take any risk to keep her baby alive, and she spends extra time teaching Rosa everything about infant care, about boiling water for formula preparation, about sterilizing bottles and equipment, about reading signs of dehydration in babies, about oral rehydration, therapy for children with diarrhea, about the careful attention that keeps children alive in conditions that want them dead. Rosa cries while learning, not from sadness but from relief, that someone is teaching her the information she desperately needs, that knowledge is available, that she doesn't have to figure everything out alone, and this moment crystallizes why the traveling teaching mission matters. There are thousands of Rosas scattered across the wasteland, young people thrust into adult responsibilities without adult knowledge, failing and watching children die because no one taught them the basics, capable of success if only someone takes time to teach them. Maya bonds with Rosa, 2 teenagers navigating post-collapse life with determination and fear and desperate hope. And Jamal watches them talk and realizes that the next generation is teaching itself, that young people learn from each other as effectively as from adults, that the teaching mission might succeed not through his efforts but through the network of relationships forming between young survivors who will carry this knowledge forward long after he's dead. The group reaches a river valley where 200 survivors have gathered, the largest concentration of people they've encountered since leaving Denver, and they discover a crisis in progress. 70 people are sick with cholera, supplies are dangerously low. Leadership has collapsed into factional fighting, and despair is driving people to consider suicide or violence or abandoning the sick to save the healthy. Jamal calls an emergency meeting and tells them the truth that no one wants to hear. 70% of you will die in the next 2 weeks if you don't fix your water treatment immediately, but 90% of you will survive if you implement proper protocols starting right now, and the choice is yours. But understand that doing nothing is choosing death. That difficulty is not an excuse for inaction, that your children are watching and will judge you based on whether you fought for their survival or surrendered to hopelessness. His words spark anger, denial, accusations that he's exaggerating or trying to scare them or doesn't understand their situation, but Rashid supports the assessment with clinical descriptions of cholera progression, dehydration timelines, mortality statistics that confirm Jamal's prediction. And Marcus shows photographs of camps they've helped, before and after images that prove water treatment works, that survival is possible, that other groups succeeded, and this group can too. Elena organizes work parties, assigning specific tasks to specific people, creating structure from chaos because humans need jobs and purpose and the feeling that their efforts matter. And within hours, they have teams building filtration systems, teams constructing solar purification stations, teams boiling water continuously to treat sick patients, teams enforcing hygiene protocols, teams teaching others what they learn. May designs a settlement-scale water treatment system that uses the river's natural flow to drive water through multiple treatment stages, producing enough clean water to serve 200 people with room for expansion if the population grows. Danny leads a children's group, teaching younger kids about water safety through games and songs, making learning fun instead of scary, creating a youth education program that will continue after the adults leave, because children teaching children is sustainable, is self-replicating, is how cultural knowledge transmits across generations. Yuki establishes an infant care program, teaching young mothers and caregivers about formula preparation, feeding schedules, hygiene protocols, early warning signs of illness, and she does this while caring for baby Sarah, demonstrating that parenting and teaching can happen simultaneously, that being responsible for a child doesn't mean abandoning responsibility for community, that motherhood is not isolation but integration into broader social networks. The cholera outbreak stabilizes after 5 days of intensive intervention, with mortality limited to 8 people whose infections were too advanced for rehydration therapy to save. But 62 survivors who would have died are now recovering, drinking oral rehydration solution and clean water, regaining strength, beginning to believe that survival is possible instead of just delaying inevitable death. The settlement's leadership restructures around competence rather than pre-collapse authority, with a council that includes Jamal and Rashid as consultants, May as chief engineer, Elena as education coordinator, and local survivors who demonstrated skill during the crisis. They create written protocols for water treatment, sanitation, waste disposal, food preparation, and community health that will govern the settlement going forward, and they train 20 locals to become teachers who can spread this knowledge to other camps, multiplying the impact of the traveling group's intervention exponentially, because teaching teachers reaches more people than teaching individuals. Rosa joins the traveling group with her 7 siblings, deciding that their survival depends on learning everything Jamal can teach, accepting the hardship of constant travel in exchange for comprehensive education that will serve them for life. Marcus's journal grows thick with notes and photographs, a manual that's becoming a textbook, and he begins organizing the content into chapters: water purification, shelter construction, food preservation, medical treatment, psychological survival, community organization, conflict resolution, each section supported by detailed instructions, diagrams, photographs, and lessons learned from mistakes that cost lives. He realizes he's creating a survival encyclopedia, a compendium of post-collapse knowledge that could be printed and distributed to survivor camps if they ever find working printing equipment, that could educate thousands or millions if civilization stabilizes enough for information networks to function again. That represents humanity's collective learning about how to survive when everything collapses. He proposes creating a library system with copies of the manuals stationed at major survivor camps, protected and copied by scribes who understand that preserving knowledge is preserving civilization, that books outlive teachers, that writing is humanity's most important technology because it allows wisdom to jump across generations without requiring direct teacher-student relationships. The traveling group swells to 30 people as they move west, collecting survivors who want to learn, who see that knowledge is wealth, who understand that education increases survival chances more than weapons or supplies, or even food stockpiles, because knowledge helps you create what you need instead of hoarding what you have. They encounter conflicts over resources, mediate disputes between camps, teach negotiation and conflict resolution alongside water purification, because survival is not just technical skills, but social skills, because humans are tribal animals who need governance structures and social norms and cultural practices that prevent violence while allowing disagreement, because rebuilding civilization requires political solutions as much as engineering solutions. Jamal finds himself becoming a reluctant leader, not because he seeks authority, but because people follow those who teach them how to survive, because authority in the post-collapse world flows from competence and service rather than from position or power, because leadership is burden accepted by those who cannot watch others fail when simple intervention would help. They reach the Utah border 63 days after leaving the stream camp, having taught water purification to thousands of survivors, having built treatment systems in dozens of camps, having created a network of educated communities that will continue teaching after the traveling group passes through. Jamal's sister has not been found. The house in Salt Lake City is empty. The note he carried for 2 months leads nowhere, and he faces the reality that Sarah is probably dead, that his last connection to pre-collapse family has been severed, that he is alone in the world except for the chosen family he's accumulated through teaching. The grief is not fresh pain, but old wound reopened, familiar ache that has become part of his daily existence, and he allows himself one night to mourn before returning to the work, because teaching cannot stop. People still need knowledge. His personal loss cannot justify abandoning public mission. Elena sits with him during that night, not speaking because words are inadequate, just presence offering comfort, and he recognizes that companionship is survival, that humans need connection not just for reproduction or resource sharing, but for maintaining sanity, for remembering why survival matters when death would be easier. The group establishes a permanent base in an abandoned university campus outside Salt Lake City, choosing the location for its infrastructure, its defensibility, its symbolic value as a place dedicated to learning, and they begin constructing what Marcus calls the Institute for Survival Knowledge, an ambitious project to create a teaching facility where survivors can study comprehensive survival curricula instead of learning piecemeal techniques. The university's science buildings still contained laboratory equipment, textbooks, reference materials that survived the collapse because knowledge written down doesn't die when people die. And May begins cataloging these resources, organizing them by topic, creating a curriculum structure that ranges from basic water treatment to advanced topics like electricity generation, food cultivation, medical procedures, and mechanical engineering. Danny and Maya become the Institute's first students, studying full-time while teaching what they learn to younger children who arrive at the campus as refugees or are born into the growing community that coalesces around the Institute. Yuki establishes a childcare program that allows parents to study or work while their children receive education and care, breaking the cycle where survival tasks consume all time and prevent learning, creating space for adults to develop skills that increase community capabilities. Baby Sarah becomes the mascot of the Institute, the child born during the teaching journey who represents hope for the next generation, who grows up surrounded by books and teachers and knowledge, and may never know a world without water purification systems. Rashid builds a medical training program, teaching basic emergency care to everyone who will learn, explaining that distributed medical knowledge is better than concentrated expertise, because injuries and illness happen everywhere. But doctors are rare, that everyone should know wound cleaning, splinting, CPR, and infection prevention because your survival might depend on whoever is nearby when catastrophe strikes. Elena creates an elementary education system, teaching children to read and write and calculate, preserving literacy that will allow them to access the textbooks and manuals and accumulated knowledge of civilization, ensuring that the next generation can build on current knowledge instead of rediscovering everything from scratch. The Institute attracts survivors from across the region, people hungry for knowledge, communities sending students to learn and return home with expertise, a flow of learners that transforms the campus into something resembling a university again, though built on survival necessity rather than academic curiosity. Jamal teaches water engineering to advanced students, showing them how to design settlement-scale systems, how to calculate flow rates and treatment capacity, how to maintain infrastructure over years instead of days, how to train others to continue the work when they die. Marcus's manual becomes the Institute's foundational text, copied by hand until they repair a solar-powered printer and can produce mass copies, distributed to every student who graduates, carried to distant camps by traveling teachers who spread knowledge like seeds that might grow into forests of understanding. May teaches civil engineering, structural design, bridge construction, road building, all the skills needed to reconnect isolated communities into networks that allow trade, travel, cultural exchange, and mutual support. The traveling group continues making expeditions from the Institute base, never abandoning the teaching mission that defines their purpose, but now they return to a home. Instead of wandering endlessly, they have students waiting for advanced instruction. They have community that depends on them, and that they depend on. They have built something beyond survival into the realm of civilization rebuilding. Rosa and her siblings thrive at the Institute, the younger ones attending school, while Rosa studies advanced subjects and teaches younger children. The family that almost died from cholera, now contributing to humanity's recovery, demonstrating that saving individuals saves their potential contributions, that investment in people pays dividends across decades. The Institute's population reaches 300 within a year, 500 within 2 years, becomes a small city within 3 years, as refugees realize that the campus offers not just survival, but quality of life, not just existence, but purpose, not just safety, but hope for better future. Jamal turns 43 years old, 8 years after the collapse, standing on the university's bell tower, looking across a settlement that includes functioning water systems, electricity from solar panels and wind turbines, farms producing food, workshops manufacturing tools, schools educating children, and hospitals treating sick. And he sees that civilization is not dead, but dormant, not destroyed, but waiting to be rebuilt by people who remember how things worked or who learn from those who remember. His daughters would be 14 now, teenagers full of potential and dreams, and he wonders what they would think of the world he's helped create, whether they would be proud of the father who couldn't save them but saved thousands of others, whether their deaths purchased the wisdom that keeps the Institute's children alive, whether meaning can be extracted from tragedy through decades of service to strangers. He decides that these questions have no answers, that meaning is not discovered but created through actions chosen daily, that the significance of his life is not measured by whether he saved his family, but by whether he helped humanity survive its near extinction, and he accepts that both are true simultaneously, that he failed the people he loved most and succeeded at helping people he never met, that life contains these contradictions without resolving them. The bell tower overlooks a valley where water flows through treatment systems he designed, where children play near streams they can drink from safely, where communities thrive because invisible threats have been tamed through knowledge and effort and systems that work. He sees Elena teaching a class of 30 children in an outdoor amphitheater, their voices carrying on the wind as they sing the water purification anthem that has become cultural tradition, that every child learns before learning to read, that encodes survival knowledge in melody so it cannot be forgotten even if writing is lost. He sees Rashid training medical students in the converted science building, teaching the next generation of healers who will carry forward the mission of preventing disease before treating illness, of recognizing that public health depends on infrastructure as much as medicine, of understanding that water systems and sanitation are medical interventions more powerful than antibiotics. He sees May supervising construction of an aqueduct that will bring clean water from mountain springs to the settlement, engineering solution to supply problem, infrastructure that serves community while training engineers who will build similar systems elsewhere. He sees Marcus photographing daily life, documenting the Institute's growth, creating visual record that will prove civilization survived the collapse, that knowledge persisted, that humans rebuilt after catastrophe because rebuilding is what humans do when giving up is easier, but not acceptable. He sees Danny, now 19 years old, and teaching water engineering to students his own age, explaining flow rates and filtration efficiency with confidence that comes from years of practice, demonstrating that the next generation is ready to carry forward the mission that teachers train teachers in infinite chain of knowledge transmission. He sees Maya, 18 years old and leading expeditions to distant camps, spreading institute-developed curricula to communities that haven't yet heard about advanced survival techniques, becoming the traveling teacher that Jamal once was, proving that the teaching mission survives beyond its founders. He sees Yuki and 9-year-old Sarah working in the children's education program, mother and daughter teaching together, demonstrating that family persists even in apocalypse, that bonds form and strengthen and create stability that makes rebuilding possible. He sees Rosa, now 23 years old and directing the Institute's teacher training program, the teenager who almost died from cholera, now ensuring that thousands of teachers graduate with comprehensive survival knowledge, multiplication of impact that justifies every hardship of the teaching journey, every cold night and hungry day and moment of despair when continuing seemed impossible. Jamal descends from the bell tower and walks to his office, a small room filled with engineering diagrams, water quality reports, letters from distant communities describing their treatment systems, photographs of students who graduated and returned home to build infrastructure, evidence that the Institute is succeeding at its mission of preserving and spreading survival knowledge. He pulls out the notebook he has kept since the collapse, the journal that begins with entries about his daughters dying, about Sarah's body being found, about the desperate research into water purification that came too late to save his family, and he reads through 8 years of teaching notes, camp descriptions, student successes and failures, lessons learned through trial and error that cost lives but generated understanding. He adds a new entry, dated 8 years after the collapse, summarizing the Institute's status, its achievements, its challenges, and his reflection on the journey from wandering teacher to reluctant leader to institutional founder. He writes about legacy, about how the teaching mission transcends his personal involvement, about how the Institute will continue after he dies, because he has trained successors, created systems, encoded knowledge in writings and teachings and cultural practices that persist beyond individuals. He closes the journal and thinks about the stream camp where this story began, where Danny almost drank contaminated water, where he made the choice to teach instead of move on alone, where the foundation of everything that followed was established in 3 days of intensive instruction. He wonders how many similar moments happened across the wasteland, how many other teachers made similar choices to share knowledge instead of hoarding it, how many other communities developed water treatment systems independently, how many of humanity's scattered survivors figured out the same truths through different paths and different tragedies and different desperate experiments. He hopes that someday, when communication networks extend across continents again, when humanity's population stabilizes and begins growing, when civilization advances past mere survival into flourishing, the Institute will connect with other knowledge centers, and they will discover that humans everywhere chose teaching over selfishness, chose sharing over hoarding, chose community over isolation, chose hope over despair, even when despair was justified by evidence and hope required faith in possibilities that seemed impossible. The future is uncertain. Survival is not guaranteed. The apocalypse could deepen instead of ending, but Jamal Thompson has done what he could with knowledge and skills and time available to him, has taught thousands who will teach millions, has built systems that will serve generations, has transformed personal tragedy into public service, has chosen meaning over nihilism every single day for 8 years, and will continue making that choice until death releases him from the burden of unconsciousness and the responsibility of teaching. This is enough. This is all anyone can do. This is why we survive. If you are watching this video from your home or your shelter or your survivor camp, if you have access to clean water or are struggling with contaminated sources, if you are teaching others or learning from someone who teaches, please share your story in the comments. Tell us where you are in the world, what time it is right now as you watch this, what survival challenges you face, what knowledge you possess that others might need. Survival is not individual achievement, but collective effort, not competition, but cooperation, not isolation, but connection across distances and differences. The Institute for Survival Knowledge began with one man teaching one boy beside one contaminated stream, and grew because people chose to learn and then to teach, because knowledge shared multiplies instead of dividing, because humanity's survival depends on all of us caring whether strangers live or die. We are all teaching each other how to survive the world we created through our civilization's collapse. We are all responsible for whether humanity continues or ends. We are all connected through the water we drink, the knowledge we share, the hope we maintain against evidence that suggests hopelessness is rational. This is the truth that Jamal Thompson learned through losing everything. That teaching saves the teacher as much as the student, that purpose is the antidote to despair, that meaning is created through service, and that civilization is just collective knowledge applied to human survival, preserved through teaching, transmitted through generations, maintained by people who care enough to share instead of hoard, to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of surrender. The water you drink today was purified by knowledge someone taught to someone else, passed down through chain of teaching that stretches back to the first human who noticed that boiling made water safer. You are alive because humans share knowledge. Honor that inheritance by teaching someone else. Continue the chain. Keep humanity alive.